Then the research about the models besting doctors in diagnosing patients was really interesting.
The diagnostic accuracy, which is so much better than a human physician prediction, like 4 times better. It's really impressive.
Welcome to Telltales. I'm Mike Nicoletti. Every week, along with my co-hosts Jason Wallace and Hunt Lawrence, we bring you the cash flow memo. Get it at telltales.us. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to dive deep into energy, technology, and healthcare. So download the memo now and get started.
The following conversation is intended for informational purposes only. You should always do your own work to determine if an investment is suitable for you.
Let's go to exhibits C. Modified a little bit last weekend. You'll notice the demand, 25 versus 24, is now down to only 500,000 barrels more. Really quite remarkable. That the U.S. is flat is not a surprise. That Europe is flat is not a surprise. That Japan is flat is not a surprise. These are mature economies, and if you sight across, they're flat. What is a surprise is China. China's actually down a little. The other surprise is other Asia. I would have expected some growth there. So it is what it is. Demand is inching up, but stress the inching. On the supply side, there's no question Saudi Arabia will be higher. There is some evidence that Russia's having trouble. They've devoted so much resources to their war effort against Ukraine that they're having trouble maintaining their production, so they're down a little. Iran will be down because U.S. sanctions are not going to be lifted, it doesn't look like. But you still have that 3.5 million barrels of extra supply now. If you turn to Exhibit B, page 2, well, it's the price last Thursday, granted, but it hasn't changed a whole lot. You do have 25 average price, a full $10 below 24, and then about flat based on the 26 future. A good question is, will it go down more with that surplus of capacity with weak demand? And the answer is that it doesn't look as though we can rule out Israel being active with their planes and missiles on Iranian facilities if they start to think that Iran is reconstituting their effort to enrich uranium. So while that is in the background or in the foreground, wherever it is, that premium, let's say, oil averaging 63 rather than 55 or something, I think it'll just linger. Natural gas is doing very well, and the worrisome thing in natural gas is LNG is finally lifting. The LNG demand was flat 24 versus 23, but it's got a good lift in 25, and we'll have some more lift in 26. But the tricky part of the demand is that demand for power is up 1.5 the last 5 years, Bs a day, and 25 versus 24 is pretty flat. And I don't see any reason why it shouldn't remain kind of flat in 26 or up a little. So it's very important to have that dry gas production not leap up. I mean, if you go back and you look at 2020, it was just under 90. That was 91.3. That was okay. But then it was 95.5 the next year and 101.8 the year after that. If we start to get some kind of a lift like that, gas prices can't stay in this $4 range. But so far, so good. So Exhibit A is interesting. I'm probably going to catch some flack from Jason and maybe Mike, but this estimated 26 forecast has our deficit declining from $1.930 to $1.5 trillion. Now, how is that happening? if you look up on the excise, which would include tariffs, that has been running around 240 billion. And for the fiscal year, and now this is the fiscal year that starts next October, so it's not the one we're in, but the future have another 250 billion of tariff revenues. I think that's a fair estimate. I don't think in the Trump administration tariffs are going to be de-emphasized, and there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of back and forth. But I do think to have that category, which includes more than just tariffs, go from 260 billion to 500 billion, I think that's reasonable. Individual income tax, payroll tax, corporate tax, all is more or less in line. So that gives you 5.5 billion in revenues. Now, what this predicts is that, or estimates, call it an estimate rather than prediction, is spending is flat. How does that happen with interest? Because we will have more debt, and interest goes from just over $1 trillion to by about 10% to 1.1 trillion. I think interest rates will be lower in the next fiscal year. I think the Fed funds rate is about to start coming down 25 basis points each meeting. So that'll help a little. There's all this publicity about Medicaid. People don't want to touch Medicare or Social Security, but they want to put work requirements in on Medicaid. And if we cite all the way back to 2018, federal spending on Medicaid was just under 400 billion. Then it was around 400 billion in 2019, 460 billion in the first COVID year, 520 in the second, 590 billion in 22, but then it's flatlined at 600 billion. So in thinking about this and what it would be in 26, I just continue to flatline. That seems like a reasonable prediction. Social Security, Medicare just kind of march up. It's just kind of a projection of what's happened over the last few years. So in the all other category, where there's got to be money to save, in 2018, before COVID, it was 780 billion, and it was 910. Then in COVID, it just skyrocketed. It was almost 3 trillion each of those years. And the Biden administration brought it down, but not fast enough. It was just under 2 trillion in 22, down to 1.3 trillion in 23, up a little in 24, down a little in 25, and I have that down by about $100 billion. I don't think that's unreasonable. Now, defense, supposedly we're authorizing more money for defense, but authorizing money and spending are two separate things. I'll be surprised. The defense budget has been flat the last 3 years at around 900 billion. I'll be surprised if more money is spent next fiscal year. And when you go through all that, you get a deficit of 1.5 trillion. Now, 1.5 trillion is still way too high, but it's progress. The way to measure the progress is to take the debt held by the public as a percentage of our GNP. And if you go all the way back to 2018, it was 79%, and it was 81. It got to 100%, and it's kind of, during COVID, it's kind of stayed there. If it just levels at 100%, that's progress. The GNP will go up. GNP is real GNP plus inflation. So I don't know what inflation is going to be, but I think that it's the GNP, no matter what happens, recession or whatnot, is still going to go up by about 4% a year. So if you can hold spending flat and maybe get a decline, you'll have progress here, and we'll look like, we'll look better than we look now, and there won't be this flight in the dollar. Everyone says, why is the dollar weak against other currencies, even though we have fairly high interest rates? I mean, if people say, will the dollar remain the reserve currency? Well, what's happening, I think it's going to be a reserve currency. If you're a central bank, and they're mostly dollars, why not have some yen bonds? Why not have some Eurodollar bonds? Why not have some gold? So, this kind of movement, steady movement away from the dollar makes sense. We're a central bank for another country. But I think if this kind of progress that you have on A can be achieved, that movement will slow down. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike and Jason to say that their partner doing this podcast is way too optimistic. But over to you, Jason, first.
Well, a couple of thoughts is during the out years of the pandemic, the dollar was strengthening quite a bit, and I haven't went back to look at how it compares historically, but maybe the weakening that we've seen this year is just kind of reverting to norms. On Medicaid, certainly it looks like that's going to take a cut this year, but I agree with you. If you look at the estimate this year, if it stayed flat and compare that back to 2019 levels, it hasn't had the growth of, it's kind of in line with defense. It hasn't had the growth of Social Security or Medicare. So is it really the problem? Maybe not.
Yes. Well, this has been an awful lot for Exhibit A, B, and C. I think what we want to do is continue with the CHIPS history, but save 5 or 6 minutes at the end to cover news on the first few pages on healthcare. So over to CHIPS history.
All right. We talked about Jason's background and how it tied into distributed computing, the days of Yahoo and Google, moving away from mainframes and towards networked x86 computers. We talked about Jim Keller and the focus on performance per watt. And that really laid the groundwork for what happened in the next decade. So we're now entering the 2010s, and we make this transition from distributed computing being sort of a novel way to accomplish specific tasks to a whole nother business model. And key to that was Amazon AWS. So AWS started as a sort of a side project that Amazon spun up internally to help their teams get access to compute. And they quickly realized that this could be a business opportunity. So it went from startup, internal startup in 2006 to a $4 billion run rate business in 2014.
Yahoo and Google and really those two companies had the original use case of we need a lot of storage and a lot of compute, and it's more than you can, a traditional business would fit into their data center. So they invented these huge, massive internet scale data centers. The amount of data produced every year grows exponentially. So within a couple of years, normal businesses started producing an amount of data they can't possibly process within their own walls. So that's when they started going to AWS and Google and saying, hey, we need to rent computer space, we need to rent storage. And that's when those businesses really started growing, is when the rest of the Fortune 500 started producing enough data that they can't do it themselves.
Right. The internal IT organizations were ballooning in size and cost. And basically Amazon was there to provide a scale solution where you could spend maybe about the same at the end of the day, but offload that expertise to somebody else. So that, as that business matured, Amazon realized that what was most important in running a data center is your performance per watt. So what's very different about purchasing a server or a laptop or a desktop is the end user in those cases doesn't really care about how much energy consumption costs. You don't really think about, is this laptop model going to cost me more in electricity versus that one? But if you're running a hyperscaler where electricity is a huge source of your costs, certainly your actual cost, non-depreciation costs, performance per watt is incredibly important. So at this point in time, Intel was the predominant supplier of CPUs. They were producing the best CPUs, and most of those were going into big data centers. And if you're a hyperscaler, you're looking at it saying, well, couldn't we optimize this with better compute balance performance. So Amazon spun up their own internal silicon effort. Their first chip was called Graviton. That was released in 2018. And what they were was essentially an ARM-based CPU server. And the end result is that Intel went from 90% market share to, under 75 over that period. So the takeaway there is that you have a different set of metrics on which to optimize when you own the whole data center versus when you're just owning different, smaller parts of it. Anything else to add on that?
Yeah, well, since the use case is running enterprise software on a server, you care less that you're running Windows. And I know we talked a lot about, the Wintel locking everyone into a Windows ecosystem. But if you're running 100,000 servers in a data center, none of them have, unless you're running Windows Server, none of them have Windows running on it. None of them have a monitor attached that you're looking at a GUI. It didn't matter. So they went to ARM.
Yeah, and this will tie to a segment for a later episode where we'll talk about software as a service. So,
yeah, let's just interject a bit. Let's just spend a few moments on ARM. ARM was, as I understand, a more efficient way to design your CPUs.
Yeah, it's a licensed architecture that you're not paying an Intel markup to access. So you can create a CPU specific to your needs. You can license that technology from ARM and then adapt it as NVIDIA is doing today, and adapt it for their own processes.
Yeah, I think of it as there's a huge amount of IP in a chip. And in order to optimize a chip for a specific use case, you may only need to change a little bit of that IP. So ARM will license you that core technology, and then all you have to do is change the part that's important to you.
It's now a public company, so it's not one we follow. Maybe we should. But it seems to me that they somehow kind of out-design Intel's equipment or Intel's offering. And it seems to me that was kind of the beginning of the huge loss of market share for Intel.
Yeah, it kind of came about with mobile.
It ties into the next piece because basically simultaneously, both in servers and more so in mobile, ARM became an incredibly relevant player. And we talked about it a little bit last week with the design of the Apple chips, which were, at least starting with the second one, fabbed by Taiwan Semiconductor, designed by Apple or PA Semi, which was an acquisition that they made where they got Jim Keller and established that process. Similar things happened at Qualcomm, where they established the Snapdragon chip. Those powered a good chunk of the Android-based phones that were developed during this decade. So both of those are incredibly dependent on ARM and then also access to Taiwan Semiconductor for chip manufacturing.
And Intel missed out on the switch to mobile, as did Microsoft and Windows. And really the constraint is the battery life on a mobile phone. You only have such a large battery and you need it. That is the thing you're optimizing for. So because Intel didn't even play in that space, ARM was able to innovate along with Qualcomm and create these much more energy efficient chips.
Yep. So Keller's prediction that performance per watt was going to be most important rang true. And basically, if you look at the history, Intel sort of ignored that. And they kind of focused on what they had done in the prior decade. They did produce some very fast chips, but they were also very power hungry.
As I recall, and then we got to get on, and we'll get GPUs next week, but as I recall, there was a series of meetings where Apple wanted Intel to design a chip, and Intel passed somehow, or am I misstating that?
Yeah, I think that was maybe from that Morris Chang interview. It's, there's different stories of that, but it seems like Intel could not wrap their heads around how big an opportunity the iPhone would be, because none of Apple's internal projections were even large enough to make Intel interested in putting such a large effort together. Taiwan Semiconductor, on the other hand, well, they also didn't believe the forecast and concluded that they would really go bankrupt if they actually had to support the forecast at different points in time. So it was one of those things. Nobody expected the iPhone to be as successful as it was. And ultimately it worked out very well for Taiwan Semiconductor. But Intel concluded that it wasn't really a great deal for them. In hindsight, they obviously would have chosen a different path.
Okay, let's take a quick break for a message from Oakcliff Sailing.
With so much happening away from Oyster Bay, we thought we'd give you a little look at what's happening here. Unfortunately, on Sunday for the Grade 5, there wasn't a lot of wind, but the race committee and the sailors cooled off with a swim and still got some really good practice in. The next day, Monday, was a day off, but no rest for the weary as they went out on the FX, the 49ers, the Ilkas, otherwise known as lasers, and the high-performance NACRA 15. The wind picked up on Monday, and then they went back out on Tuesday, and that day the wind built more and more and more, and they got into a little bit of survival conditions when a thunderstorm rolled in. At that point, all phones were away. Lots more happening in the high-performance world at Oakcliff this summer.
And now, back to the show.
Well, we got about 7 or 8 minutes left. Let's do early pages on news. There's Apple news. Jason, they're still wandering around, I guess. They say they're going to use someone else's language model to try to upgrade Siri.
Yeah, and that's probably the smart thing for them to do anyway. It's kind of what we figured they would have to do. And why devote all those resources to trying to keep up with all this model development when they can license it and be the hardware provider of how you access any of these models? So I think it's a smart move if they do that. And I think they should, rather than partner, I think they should open up some sort of platform where all of them can access the iPhone.
Yep. And we've often said that the reason Apple hasn't done it is because it would violate their internal rules around privacy. But they're violating those actively today. I don't know if any of you got the notification to buy discounted tickets for the Formula One movie.
No, I could use that.
Yeah, we're going to watch that tonight, actually. But, it just seems like that was a very blatant violation of Apple's own view on advertising to send a push advertisement to everybody for an Apple product. But they did it. So it seems like Apple's willing to change. And, maybe that's a sign of the times.
I thought it was all disingenuous anyway when they shut Meta out because they're starting their own advertising program. So yeah, they're willing to use your data for themselves.
But now, if you use Microsoft Copilot, you get to use multiple language models, I guess. You get now or you will, because Microsoft seems to have made room for not just OpenAI, but XAI and Anthropic and even possibly Gemini.
Yeah, it seems like and I don't know if this is intentional, but the models are kind of finding where they're best at, and people are starting to realize that. So people are using Anthropic to write code because it writes better code. They're using different models to generate images because they create much more realistic images. You're hearing software companies build their infrastructures so that it's easy to swap out which model gets used for which specific task. And I think most software applications now in the future will make use of all the models, and they'll pick the best one at the time for that task.
Yeah, I really like the stuff where they pit models against each other, because I spend a lot of time doing that, actually. Like I'll use Gemini, ChatGPT, Perplexity all at the same time with similar prompts, and kind of so that way I'm building consensus or at least trying to get a different perspective. So it's tough because the question is this going to be a winner take all market, or is there going to be multiple different models? And you can make a case for either, but this multiple different models seems to work pretty well.
Then the research about the models besting doctors in diagnosing patients was really interesting because the way they accomplished this was to have all the models kind of debate amongst each other on what the diagnosis should be. So you can envision it as, rather than just going to one person to get an opinion, you're getting 5 different opinions, and they're working together as a team and diagnosing a patient in this case.
Yeah, and the diagnostic accuracy, which is kind of one of the coolest charts out of this research out of Microsoft, is, I mean, it's so much better than a human physician prediction, like 4 times better. It's really impressive.
Yeah. Healthcare news, Jason.
A little bit of news from Vertex is maybe their closest competitor in a form of kidney disease that Vertex is currently in a phase 3 study for their treatment called POVI. Their competitor released their top line data for their phase 3 study. They achieved I think a 46% reduction in protein buildup that occurs in the kidneys due to this condition. And then the phase 2 study that Vertex ran, they achieved a 66% reduction. So it's still looking like Vertex has the best in class therapy for that particular kidney disease, which is good news. You know, I've seen a lot of people throw around different estimates on what Vertex, their CF franchise is worth today. I put it at just under 400 a share, and I think you can buy Vertex for like 445 today, around there. So you're really paying a small premium for this pipeline that doesn't just include the non-opioid pain treatment. Their franchise for kidney drugs is not just POVI. They have a couple others. That could be as big as the CF. So, you know, I really think it's long-term, this is a good opportunity. Mm-hmm. And we do own it, so probably should say that.
Yeah.
I guess a couple other things is the NIH announced that they're going to require all research that they've funded to be made publicly available when it's published, which sounds like good news. I don't necessarily have my head wrapped around it. Right now, you have to subscribe to a professional journal, and it usually gets published there. I don't know if that kind of funds the peer review process or not. So on the surface, it sounds like a great thing. Everyone's going to have access to all this research, but it might have, implications down the line.
Right. Personnel that, RFK Jr. is very controversial, but it seems like the personnel that is staffing the different health agencies seems way, way, way above what we've been used to.
It is phenomenally impressive. The rest of the government seems to be pretty chaotic, but everything we're seeing in NIH and health side of things is really, really impressive.
Yeah. I mean, not all of it is great news, but I think most of it is. And then the focus tends to be on the negatives. So a couple weeks ago, we talked about software they're rolling out that looks for fraud in the Medicare and Medicaid systems. And the DOJ just announced they're bringing a case for, I believe it was like a $14 billion fraud they uncovered with fraudulent Medicare billing. So it involved a process of stealing Americans' identities and submitting false claims. That's a pretty large fraud. So if they're uncovering these kinds of things, that should be a savings. The government's own estimate, there was $100 billion in fraud every year. So they're taking bites at it.
Good. I think we've run out of runway. Let's just, as coming attraction for our last or next to last chapter in chips history, I guess we get into GPUs next week.
Yeah, so we'll go back in time a little bit and cover GPUs up until today, because right now the majority of the chip industry, what's interesting is GPUs. And we'll do our best to provide a little bit of a view as to what we think will happen over the next 5 to 10 years. It's a long time in chip history, so take that with a grain of salt. But yeah, next week we'll wrap up this chip history segment.
Yeah. Then we're going to do software history. Jason, Mike, and I were talking this morning, said we have to go back pretty early. And Mike said, oh, yeah, probably punch cards. So once you finish GPUs, we'll start at the very beginning of software. In the meantime, everyone, well and stay healthy. And we'll see you exactly 7 days from now. Take care.
The views expressed on this podcast are the hosts alone and do not constitute an offer to sell or a recommendation to purchase or a solicitation of an offer to buy any security nor a recommendation for any investment product or service. While certain information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, neither the hosts nor any of their employers or their affiliates have independently verified this information, and its accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed. Accordingly, no representation or warranty, expressed or implied, is made as to, and no reliance should be placed on, the fairness, accuracy, timeliness, or completeness of this information. The hosts and all employers and their affiliated persons assume no liability for this information and no obligation to update the information or analysis contained herein in the future and may or may not hold positions in the securities mentioned.